The new Wolverine trailer for the PS5 just dropped. Omega Red is in it, and you guys have been asking me to cover Omega Red, right? The first time he appears, the fight between himself and Wolverine, and where Wolverine gets dominated by Omega Red. So, what this does here is this goes all the way back to 1991, when I first started reading comics, and this picks up in the South Pacific. Now, it says, on geologic maps, this volcano isle is listed as dormant and of little interest. As is often the case, appearances can be deceiving. The core of this hollow mountain is hot indeed, a laying of hands. There is nothing gentle in what unfolds. 20 men die in as many seconds, and is their fate any less horrible that it was by their own choosing? 20 men die that one may find a new purchase on life. Because what's happening here is the hand is waking up Omega Red. Now, quick explanation about his character, because Marvel has never given us a mini-series or a one-shot comic or really anything of any major significance that gives us a full-on origin of Omega Red. It's kind of all over the damn place, right? It's in Generation X issues 10 through 11, Wolverine Volume 3, issue number 20 from Greg Pak, the Maverick one-shot from Larry Hama back in 1997, but most of that stuff just kind of retells the same thing or like offers a line of dialogue that kind of expands on something in a significant way. And so the long and short of Omega Red is that his name is actually Arkady Rossovich, and basically he's a mutant. Now here's the funny thing. The idea of him being a mutant kind of fed into everything that was going on with like Colossus and those guys, Russia's answer to the Avengers, and we'll talk about that here in a little while. But the reality here is he's always kind of been a psychopath, but he's always just taken enjoyment in killing as many people as he possibly can. That initially started with animals and then basically the homeless because it seemed like nobody would ever really miss them. Eventually he just ends up joining Spetsnaz, so like Russian special forces basically. This is all taking place way back in the 60s. But the way that he becomes Omega Red is eventually it's discovered that he's a psychopath and a killer. And so where he was supposed to be executed, instead he was taken and brought in as basically a new super soldier. So something to understand is that with Captain America, right, Project Rebirth, and the formation of the Avengers, that Russia in a lot of ways answered in kind, mostly because of the fact that the comics were being done at a time when you had the Cold War, right? So the Great Space Race, the United States versus Russia, capitalism versus communism, so on and so forth. And so while Russia did have things like Siberia Force or the People's Protectorate, which ultimately merged to become the Winter Guard as we know it now, essentially Russia's version of the Avengers, they also had things like Department X, right? The attempt to create super soldiers, the Winter Soldier Bucky Barnes, so on and so forth. Omega Red was one of those. Now, with Omega Red being a mutant, in addition to having carbonadium bonded to him in the form of tentacles, which he can basically use to absorb people's life energy, his inherent mutant power is the release of death spores, which, depending on the abilities of the person who is infected by those death spores, they either die immediately or it could take them weeks, right, to basically perish if they even die at all. So someone with a really advanced healing factor, like Wolverine, can last pretty long and ultimately overcome it depending on who's telling the story. The Incredible Hulk would likely be the same way. I'm not aware of Omega Red and the Incredible Hulk fighting in a meaningful way like that, but it stands to reason to believe the Hulk could. Whereas if he just ran up on like a dude and used his death spores, they're dead right off the bat. I mean, they would die within seconds. There's no way they would be able to overcome that. What ends up happening is that Omega Red is essentially locked away, and that's basically where he returns in this particular story. Something else to point out here, because I feel like if I don't, people are going to flip their lid. Carbonadium was Russia's attempt to duplicate adamantium. Adamantium was created unintentionally by Myron McClane, right? He literally fell asleep. In the same way that penicillin was discovered because a doctor fell asleep, Myron McClane fell asleep when he was using Wakanda vibranium to create a new shield for Captain America. In an effort to duplicate Captain America's shield, Myron McClane ended up making adamantium. So again, Russia tried to respond in kind. Carbonadium is more malleable, but it's not nearly as durable or indestructible as adamantium is. The important thing here is that the reason why Omega Red has been woken up is one part due to a guy named Matsuo, who we'll talk about here in a minute, and another group called Fenris, which are basically just the children of Baron von Strucker, and then we'll talk about them here in a second as well. But focusing on Wolverine, what is going on here is that Gambit and Rogue are basically heading out for a night on the town, right? Essentially having a date night of sorts. And the X-Men being the X-Men are like, look, I mean, here's the thing. Like, we know we're not supposed to go with you guys, but like, we kind of got to see this go down, right? Like, what does a date between Gambit and Rogue actually look like. The problem is that in the midst of all of this, while the X-Men are kind of tailing Gambit and Rogue are hit by a booby trap, only to find out that it's actually the Hand that had seized them. Not only that, Omega Red is there and immediately ensnares them in his tentacles. And then following that, the Hand basically go after like Wolverine and Beast, the guys who were following the X-Men. Now, it's also important to note at this point, Beast is basically using a holographic inducer, right, to hide the fact that he's blue and furry and he just looks like a regular guy. But when the Hand shows up here, because of Omega Red's presence and because of the fact that Omega Red knows who Wolverine is, he subdues them incredibly fast. Now, one of the other things to know is that this is kind of a different variation of the Hand that we're traditionally used to. Normally, the Hand are like just mystical ninjas from Japan, right? They can be resurrected from the dead, and when the Hand comes after you, they send hundreds at a time. With Matsuo taking over the Hand, it became a more kind of modern technological version of what the organization had historically been. So a little bit of explanation there for those of you guys who are familiar with it, but don't really know where that transition comes from. But regardless, Omega Red takes Wolverine down incredibly fast. And in fact, Wolverine recognizes Omega Red by referring to him as Arkady. At that point, the Hand ends up donning some ambulance costumes and then essentially gets away. Not only that, right, with Colossus and Cyclops and Psylocke and these guys, knowing that there was some kind of huge energy signature that went off, right, an explosion this close to the ground, something's going on there. And while they weren't with the rest of the X-Men when the ambush happened, of course, they end up going to investigate. Forge is kind of the one that tips them off to what's happening. But this does give the opportunity for Cyclops and all those guys to show up, because at this point, they're acting incredibly fast and the reaction time is almost instantaneous. When they show up here, they basically rescue the captured X-Men outside of Wolverine. But the problem is that Psylocke, using her telepathy to analyze the entire situation, realizes that there's basically a self-destruct device within the vehicle. And while they end up activating, at least the Hand does, and Psylocke tells everybody to get out of there as fast as they can, basically everybody survives and they're fine. Mostly just because of the fact that Colossus, right, having his osmium metal skin, can survive the explosion himself and everybody else gets out in time. And so at that point, because Wolverine's mask had essentially been left behind, they realize he's been taken somewhere else. And that's when you end up with this just knockdown, drag-out fight between Wolverine and Omega Red. And this is the crazy thing, because while Jim Lee kind of gives this to us as sort of dropping us in the middle of the history between these two, this is at a point in time in Wolverine's history. This is long before Wolverine Origins from Daniel Way, right, when he regained all his memories. So in a lot of ways, the whole idea that Wolverine doesn't fully know his past is still a part of his comic landscape, right? So you're kind of learning these small little things as they go on. And so there's a lot of commentary that goes back and forth between the two, right? Wolverine saying things like, "You're as fast as you ever were, Arkady, but I've learned a few new tricks since last time." And the whole fight is actually being watched, right? We're just kind of like, this is sort of incredible to see these two guys go back and forth. But ultimately, who's going to come out on top? And in fact, the people who are watching this are Dr. Abraham Cornelius, Matsuo, and Fenris, also known as the Von Strucker kids. So here's the thing to know about their involvement here. Yes, they were instrumental in securing the release of Omega Red, and they kind of want to use them for their own purposes, and it's really just to become a part of the Upstarts. So in Marvel Comics, back in Uncanny X-Men 286, I think it was, the villain Selene initiated the Upstarts program as basically creating her own version of the Hellfire Club. But instead of just bringing people in, they had to essentially demonstrate that they were worthy of being a part of Selene's group. And so everybody had an individual task that they had to undertake, right? Something of note, of significance. When it came to someone like Trevor Fitzroy, for example, he killed the Reavers and he killed Donald Pierce, right? Two individuals who were staunchly anti-mutant and exceedingly capable in their own right. When it comes to the Von Strucker twins, securing Omega Red is actually a huge deal, Russia's version of the Super Soldier program. And there's a way in which they keep him on the hook, which is actually one of the coolest things about this. Now, as for Matsuo, he is kind of instrumental in the story of Psylocke, and that's really his main goal here, right? Going after Psylocke herself. The quick and dirty explanation of what went on with her, I mean, we do have a video that explains it, is that there was a story back in the 80s called The Fall of Mutants, and it actually had 3 different versions. Uncanny X-Men and X-Factor and New Mutants, I think, was the other one. In Uncanny X-Men, that was the story that dealt with all the X-Men coming together and then helping to defeat the adversary with Storm and Forge, so on and so forth. The important thing is that at the end of that story, they all kind of of went through the Siege Perilous, which sort of allowed them to restart their lives. Betsy Braddock, Psylocke, just washed up on the shores of Japan. And Matsuo, whose love interest Kwannon was in a comatose state, wanted to use Betsy Braddock to basically bring Kwannon back. What ended up happening was a mind swap. So the mind of Betsy Braddock went into the body of Matsuo's lover Kwannon, and Kwannon's mind went into the body of Betsy Braddock. And so at that point, the intention of Matsuo was to just brainwash the new Betsy Braddock in Kwannon's body to become an assassin, effectively turning her into what used to be his lover, right? His love interest. Things didn't necessarily work out as well. Ultimately, Psylocke defects, she joins the X-Men, she forms a kind of psychic bond with Wolverine, and now we're here, right? Again, there's a lot more to it than that, but that's just the sort of quick and dirty explanation on that whole thing. What is important here is that throughout all of this whole fight being watched, Wolverine starts having these flashbacks, right, to when he was part of Team X, alongside Sabretooth and Kestrel and Maverick, and their goal is to enter into this place and to extract a woman by the name of Janice Hollenbeck. Now, we'll talk about why she matters here in a minute and how it all kind of ties together. But following Wolverine's unceremonious defeat at the hands of Omega Red, who just completely dominated him, at that point, he's just kind of strung up. And the reason why they have him captive is because they need to know the location of the carbonadium synthesizer. Now, the carbonadium synthesizer is quite literally a device that keeps Omega Red stable. The reason being that because carbonadium is kind of a cheap knockoff of adamantium, so as a kind of differentiation between adamantium and carbonadium insofar as how they affect people, adamantium, quote-unquote, poisons Wolverine. But I don't necessarily know if I would specify that way. The reality here is that adamantium is a foreign body in Wolverine's body, and so his healing factor is always trying to undo it. It is poisoning him to a degree, but not nearly as extreme as carbonadium. The reality is that if Wolverine didn't have adamantium bonded to his skeleton and his healing factor wasn't always trying to fight it, he would actually live for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. Carbonadium, on the other hand, does truly poison Omega Red through radiation. The carbonadium synthesizer is what basically balances that out. It neutralizes the poisoning within Omega Red's body. And so without it, it's only a matter of time before Omega Red dies. The crazy thing about all of this is that where Omega Red is taunting Wolverine in various ways, right, where he says, yes, take him, let him try to sleep. If there is sleep for one whose dreams are places of darkness and despair, at least they are if there's any justice in this world. That the whole situation is actually being watched by Maverick. And again, this is kind of bringing in interesting elements from these characters and bits of past. Because where Maverick ends up basically taking down the lights and Wolverine pops his claws after essentially being freed and attacking everybody, that's when he just kind of like holds this canister and he doesn't know where he is. He doesn't know what's going on. And he's like, I got this stuff. And he just says, everybody just back off, right? I don't know what's been going on around here. And I don't aim to wait to find out. And that's where Omega Red is just like, too bad for you, my old friend. There is only one way out of here, and that is through me. Now surrender the canister. And Wolverine's just like, surrender? Not gonna happen, right? That word just isn't in my vocabulary. And Wolverine takes off. And so at that point, again, he kind of starts having these flashbacks, specifically when he was part of Team X. Now, for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with it, we don't necessarily have to go too in-depth into it. Team X was essentially a wet work team. They were sent on a variety of different missions. They had technically operated under Weapons Plus as part of the United States CIA, but there was a lot of mental reconditioning, right? This sort of took place before Wolverine was inducted into the Weapon X program and had adamantium bonded to his skeleton. But this flashback that he has is of Team X, himself and Maverick and Sabretooth, basically leading Janice Hollenbeck out of this facility. Now, Janice Hollenbeck was actually a double agent. The idea was that she was essentially selling information to both sides. In this particular instance, she was selling information to the Americans about Russia's super soldier program, specifically Omega Red. And the one thing that Omega Red needs in order to essentially keep himself alive is the carbonadium synthesizer, which they currently have in their possession by way of Janice Hollenbeck. And so Wolverine kind of having these hallucinations, almost sort of reliving these moments as he's like running through this hallway and trying to get away. Omega Red says, so we begin again, Wolverine, this time without the drug. shrugs, without the watchful eyes. This time, the victory will be truly mine. And that's where Wolverine's just like, wrong again, and jumps out the window. The problem is that when he's supposed to go crashing down to the ground, he doesn't. And in fact, somebody had saved him, only for us to find out it was Maverick who saved him. And he just tells Wolverine, right, safe for now, lie still, Logan, you've taken some beatings in your day. I know, I was there for some of them, but you're gonna need all you can squeeze out of your muty healing factor to pull through the beating that Omega Red just gave you. And where Wolverine starts talking about how he has to find Omega Red, Maverick is just like, no, right, not a chance, right? You're lucky I was there to save you. Now just lie there and heal. It's what you do best, no matter what anybody else says. And once you're fit, we're getting out of here. The problem is that the alarm systems go off, and where he's essentially being hidden in the same building that they initially had him in, right? Kind of hiding right under everybody's nose. The X-Men were finding where Wolverine was. They've been hunting for him this whole time, and they finally located him. So you actually have two teams that are launching an attack to find Wolverine. You've got Rogue, you've got Psylocke, and you have Gambit alongside Beast, Cyclops, and Jubilee. And even Maverick himself is just kind of like, why do they have this walking light show with them? They probably think that they're the ones that are best at keeping her from getting killed. And so it's kind of a funny moment because it shows that a lot of people just don't take Jubilee seriously, which makes no sense because she's one of the most powerful mutants in existence, right? She has the potential to detonate matter on a subatomic scale, right? Create atomic explosions out of nothing. And so, of course, the X-Men making their way through this facility, the whole time, they're hunting for Wolverine, only to be met by Omega Red. And Omega Red takes these guys out with a quickness. He literally wraps up Cyclops in his tentacles, and he just starts telling them, to a degree, like what it is that he can do, right? He says these coils are made of carbonadium, a more malleable form of adamantium, not nearly as indestructible as the vaunted metal, but they serve their purpose as a conduit for my mutant death factor. And where Jubilee goes to fire her attack at Omega Red is able to release his pheromones, but not enough to kill her, simply enough to basically knock her out. Because the reality here is that with the X-Men being here, now they can use them as bait to lure Wolverine out. The problem is that it's entirely possible Wolverine just won't show up anyway, right? And so what they end up doing, or at least what Matsuo does, is he actually brings in a third party, right? He says, any moment now, we're expecting a specialist who will help us find your missing savior. And so at that point, with Maverick watching everything that's going on, right, by way of view screen monitors, and at the same time, Wolverine basically bleeding in such a way that his healing factor doesn't really seem to be kicking in as fast as it should, or at the very least, Maverick just needs him awake. He literally gives him a shot of neuroepinephrine to wake him up. Right? So that's kind of nuts. And then that's when you kind of jump back and Wolverine gets this flashback where you have him and the rest of Team X. Janice Holenbeck is here and basically they're trapped, right? There's seemingly no way for them to get out and Omega Red is coming for them. And the reality here is they can't stay here because if they do, Omega Red will kill them. And that's literally what's said, right? Like Janice says, the guards have the exits covered and the super soldier has been activated. At that point, Sabretooth's just kind of like the whole job stinks of a setup. And that's where Maverick's like, we have the carbonadium synthesizer and our lovely double agent. All we need now is to get out of here alive. And that's why Wolverine chimes in and is like, look, man, getting out is easy. Alive is going to be the tough part. And where initially they're like, look, we're 10 floors up. If we jump out 10 floors, she's going to be killed. The response of Sabretooth is, do you have any idea what they'll do with you now that they know your cover's blown, Janice? You're going to look a lot more creative than a stain on the sidewalk. And so it's just like, there's no time for any of this, right? We got to jump out the window and we have to get out of here as fast as we can. So Sabretooth kills Janice, right? Referring to her as a liability. And at that point, Wolverine is just like, you're an absolute psychopath. He's pissed off to no end. But the reality here is they've got bigger fish to fry. They got to survive. Omega Red is right there. So at that point, they jump out of the building 10 stories down to the ground. The healing factor takes care of the rest, and they all end up getting out of there, along with the carbonadium synthesizer in hand. Now, of course, Wolverine brings Janice's corpse with him because she'll be the key to all of of this. But while Cyclops and Beast and those other guys are being attacked by Omega Red, the Hand are making their move against Gambit, Rogue, and Psylocke. And in fact, the X-Men are able to hold their own against the Hand quite readily. But then the Von Strucker twins show up. Now, the thing about the Von Strucker twins is that technically they're kind of engineered to a degree, in the sense that they have abilities, but their genes were modified in utero. So in effect, they're almost like the Wonder Twins from DC. If they hold hands, they can fire off plasma blasts of incredible power. And in fact, they do that. They fire them off on all the X-Men. Gambit ends up taking a brunt of the blast, and initially the question is asked by Rogue, right? Like, how's he gonna be? And Psylocke just kind of like, well, I mean, I think he'll be okay. And then she immediately turns against Rogue, right? Like, takes Rogue out with her psychic dagger, only for us to find out that when the initial body swap and everything had taken place, and that Betsy Braddock's mind had been put in the body of Quanon, there was a hypnotic suggestion back in Uncanny X-Men 256 that Matsuo had installed in her subconscious, that at the right moment, he could activate it, and in turn, Psylocke would fall under his control. So arguably, the most powerful telepath that the X-Men have in this particular moment is now working against them. And so at that moment, you jump back to Wolverine, right? Literally, he kind of comes back to his normal self, and he doesn't recognize who Maverick is. In fact, he says that, right? Maverick says, "That's it, Logan, right? Work through it all." And Logan just says, "You got me at a disadvantage, bub. You know my name, but I don't know you from Adam." And so at that point, Maverick's like, he's telling the truth, right? He doesn't really know. He doesn't remember any of this. He doesn't remember anything about me or who I am. Now, this is all new history for Wolverine in Marvel Comics. So as the reader, we're kind of learning about it as we're reading about all of this. And so Maverick kind of fills in the gaps here a little bit, right? And he says, we were a small group back then, right? A hand-picked cadre of agents from different countries. Logan from Canada, Creed from who knows where, and me, the resident West German freedom fighter. We were quite the team until Creed snapped. It was 3 years before we learned what Creed had already suspected, that he and Logan shared an accelerated healing factor, while my mutant power to absorb kinetic impact barely saved me from that top 10 story drop. It wasn't until the debriefing 24 hours later that we all started pounding nails into the team's coffin, right? There was talk about the loss of the carbonadium synthesizer. It was an unacceptable thing. That was their main mission, was to find it and bring it back, right? Your incompetence has severely compromised everything, right? Victor Creed's response, our incompetence, it was your shoddy intelligence that got us into that no-win scenario and cost the life of Janice. But at that point, Wolverine snaps, right? It's like, you killed Janice in cold blood because you panicked. And of course, Sabretooth fires back, and it's just like, it ain't your place to question me, boy, not in the middle of an assignment, and not ever. I saved your sorry hide more times than I can remember. And he says, you're mine, and the day is gonna come when I collect. So that kind of built on the existing animosity between Wolverine and Sabretooth, kind of reaffirming the fact that none of them can really work together. But while Maverick is sort of musing over all of this, right, thinking these thoughts, he asks himself the question, if Wolverine didn't take the carbonadium synthesizer with him, with all the tooling around that Matsuo and Cornelius have been doing in his head, then I think now is not the time for me to do anything to shatter his fragile psyche, which means I either respond as Sergeant David North, Logan's drinking buddy, or Maverick. And he decides to go the route of Maverick, because it seems to be the one thing that Wolverine would be receptive to. And in fact, there is a little bit of a scuffle between the two of them, but Wolverine seems to pick up on the fact that Sabretooth is back here, because in fact, Sabretooth was the person who was called in by Matsuo to find Wolverine. One, because of the animosity between the two of them, but two, if there's anyone out there capable of finding Wolverine, no matter where he is in the world, it's Sabretooth, right? I mean, these guys have each other's blood scent. And so with all the X-Men essentially tied up and Wolverine out there with Maverick, the role that Sabretooth has is fleshed out a little bit more here, right? When Matsuo tells him, Psylocke only responds to my commands, Sabretooth, and then only grudgingly. I trust you'll be more accommodating in your search for Wolverine. Of course, he kind of makes that statement about Psylocke in the face of Sabretooth, handing Psylocke his coat and just being like, be a dear and hang up the coat. Treating her like the help. essentially. But that's where Cornelius comes in and says, we believe he has access to a particular device which will aid our Russian ally. And so Sabretooth just kind of says, it's a funny thing about your red buddy, something vaguely familiar, right? It'll come to me. Now, here's an important thing to understand. The reason why Sabretooth doesn't really remember Omega Red, and the reason why Wolverine doesn't really remember Omega Red, is because of guys like Abraham Cornelius. He was there when the adamantium was bonded to Wolverine's skeleton. But beyond that, Weapons Plus routinely did mind wipes on Wolverine. And it's the reason why Wolverine does not remember where he put the carbonadium synthesizer after they initially had it. And it's why Sabretooth doesn't really remember Omega Red all that well, because those memories have been overlapped and they've been replaced and they've been covered over and all kinds of stuff. It's an absolute nightmare up in these guys' heads. What's also kind of interesting is Sabretooth directly addresses Gambit, right? And he's like, I never forget a sin. A long way from the Big Easy, Remy. Since when did you start working on the side of angels? Or did I just blow your latest scam? Because keep in mind, the last time that Sabretooth and Gambit worked together up to this point was the Mutant Massacre. Of course, Gambit didn't know that the Morlocks were going to be killed in the sewers of New York, but still, right, some sketchy history that goes on there. But of course, with Maverick basically leading Wolverine essentially out of an escape, Sabretooth and Psylocke ultimately catch up to him. And what's also funny here is that Sabretooth does not remember Maverick either, right? So it's kind of nuts, because in that moment, Sabretooth is like, okay, cool. Well, now that Wolverine's here, time to do my job. He goes in for the attack. Sabretooth takes them both out in the blink of an eye. It's nuts how fast he takes these guys out. It happens so incredibly quickly. One, because Wolverine's not quite up to snuff, and two, because Maverick would never stand a chance against someone like Sabretooth. It's just not going to happen. And Sabretooth, backed by Psylocke, that's not going to happen either. And so with Wolverine basically recaptured, in turn, you kind of have a celebration, because now they have everything they need. And in fact, Matsuo tells Omega Red, right? He says, you are still dependent on the life forces of others, Omega Red. To that end, I suggest you avail yourself of our prisoners, i.e. the X-Men. Kill as many as you wish. And so once Wolverine is brought back to the facility, like the number one priority here is to dig around in his brain and to find out where he put the carbonadium synthesizer, whatever it is that they have to do in order to make it happen, because the memories have to be in there somewhere, even if they're scrambled eggs, because of all the work of Weapons Plus. Not only that, because of the fact that they can't necessarily trust the images they're seeing, or at least they're flickering through too fast and they're all disordered in order for anybody to understand it, Matsuo ends up donning a device that actually allows him to monitor Wolverine's memories as they occur. And he says, what I want to know is what he did with the carbonadium synthesizer. And so as literally Cornelius is instructed, turn up the juice, get this guy's memories going. Initially, he's hesitant to do it, but at the threat of his own death, he ultimately does. And so what ends up happening is you pick up in those final moments after Janice Hollenbeck had been killed, and they jumped out of the building. And where there's some taunting back and forth between Wolverine and Sabretooth, the key thing that Wolverine says here in this memory is he says, Janice, darling, I got one last assignment for you. And that's when Matsuo picks it up, that Wolverine buried the carbonadium synthesizer with Janice Hollenbeck. And as soon as that information comes out, Psylocke turns against everybody. And it's amazing, right? She says, I feigned obedience and deference to Wolverine's wishes long enough to learn the whereabouts of the carbonadium synthesizer. With the information now secured by the psychic bond that we share, your services are no longer required. It was Wolverine's near death that freed me from Matsuo's mental thrall. I have been waiting for the moment to strike. And where Omega Red just says, like, I hope it was worth it, right? I have already single-handedly bested your teammates. Do you believe you stand a chance against my carbonadium coils, or that your paltry psychic powers can stem the flow of my mutant death factor? The response to Psylocke? Actually, yes. And she literally overcomes him, right? And here's the crazy thing. This is why fighting Psylocke is such a dangerous game, because she says, I had you psionically convinced you actually released your death-inducing ability. And so she says, the truth, I had you psionically convinced you actually released your death-inducing ability. And so that's where Omega Red is like, then the life essence I've been draining from you to sustain my own. And Psylocke just says, a figment of your imagination. But just for the record, the piercing sensation in your left lung, that's genuine, right? That's the danger of fighting a telepath. You don't know if you're actually fighting them at all. Not only that, right, with everything that's going on, Maverick overcomes all of them. But Sabretooth doesn't do anything, right? He just kind of stands there the entire time. And in fact, one of the hand agents is forced by Maverick into revealing where Wolverine is being held. And so with Sabretooth working alongside him, you end up finding out the reason that's happening is because Psylocke has him under her command. And she has for quite some time. Ever since she regained herself, her mental faculties, and was feigning control, she put Sabretooth under her thrall. The problem with this is that it all rests on Psylocke staying conscious. The instant she falls unconscious, everybody goes back into their normal state. And that's exactly what happens. That when Maverick comes running in alongside Sabretooth to free all of the other X-Men, that coincides with Matsuo sneaking up behind Psylocke and knocking her out. And when that happens, Sabretooth turns back into his normal self, but not before Jubilee is freed, and then in turn can free everybody else. But with Psylocke down, Matsuo turns his attention to Wolverine. And he says at last, the final obstacle has been removed. With the X-Men indisposed and the carbonadium synthesizer within our grasp, nothing can stand in our way. And Wolverine, right, just basically playing possum, is like, you mean to tell me a mutant healing factor, 300 pounds of adamantium skeleton with claws, countless hours of training in a danger room, and you have the nerve to call that nothing? So tell me, what does it take to impress you people? And the fight is back on between himself and Omega Red. The crazy thing is that Omega Red wraps him up in those tentacles yet again. And while it's not enough to kill Wolverine, it is enough to get him distracted, because at that point, Sabretooth comes flying in the window, right? Flying right through all that glass. And Cyclops is there with Maverick and the rest of the X-Men, and they're just like, yeah, so you guys have something that belongs to us, and we're not too keen on the fact that you stole it. We're the X-Men, son. Let's help these guys understand their place in the bigger picture. So Rogue steps up and she demolishes Omega Red. Dude, she bodies this guy, right? And it's kind of funny because the whole time it's happening, like, he's talking trash, right? He's like a coward at that, attacking me from behind. Even Americans should have better manners. And Rogue's just like, don't worry, man. The pounding that I'm about to deliver will be face to face. She's like, and just to make sure we were close enough to tell your fan club that you don't risk shooting and spraying your death factor all over the place. And that's where Matsuo is like, actually, she's right, Omega Red, right? If you employ your mutant power now, you will kill the only two men capable of prolonging your life. And so in effect, it's basically a stalemate, right? Omega Red can't use the spores or he's going to kill the people that they need. But at the same time, the X-Men don't necessarily kill. And that's kind of how it goes down. That what ends up going on here is that Maverick alongside the X-Men, when they secure Wolverine, they bail out, they take off. And in fact, it's kind of done at the direction of Maverick himself. The reason being because they're in Germany. And so once everything kind of gets back to normal, and because Maverick is essentially an agent of the state, he says, like, if you guys had stayed there and launched a prolonged attack, it would be seen as Americans, and mutants no less, invading a foreign country and launching an attack on the citizens in that country, right? The individuals of that country. That would start an international crisis, right? So the X-Men are just kind of like, yeah, that's probably not a good idea. And so Wolverine, right, ever the loner, right, the guy kind of doing his own thing, he is told by Cyclops, look, whatever it is that you need to do, we have your back the entire way, right? We will help you. But the response of Wolverine, no, right? I mean, it is cool to know that you guys are there, and I love that I have friends and family, especially after spending so much of my life alone. But the reality is that I need to do this on my own. And so at that point, you pick up with Matsuo and the Hand, who were at the grave of Janice Hollenbeck, right? And these guys, I never heard the like digging up the grave of Janice Hollenbeck, right? They're desecrating her corpse, right? All in the pursuit of locating the carbonadium synthesizer. The problem is that once they get this casket out of the ground, Wolverine is in it. Somehow or another, beyond our ability to understand, Wolverine somehow got underground without seemingly disturbing the dirt, and basically entered the coffin of Janice Hollenbeck and has just been there ever since. And in fact, the question Matsuo asks is like, how could you have gotten here? And the only statement that Wolverine makes is he's like, before you, right, I didn't have to wait until dark. And he just says, give it your best shot, boys. You'd hate to deny a dying man his last wish. And so literally Wolverine tears these members of the Hand apart, but Abraham Cornelius is there with a gun in his hand and literally aiming it at Wolverine, presumably getting ready to shoot him in the head. I don't know what good he thinks it'll do. Wolverine's got an adamantium skull, but the fact is, Maverick shoots Abraham Cornelius and kills him on the spot. And so now that all family business has been taken care of, Wolverine gives the carbonadium synthesizer back to Maverick, and then basically just disappears like Batman. So yeah, guys, this is the first appearance of Omega Red in Marvel Comics. 1990s comics, in the days of Jim Lee writing X-Men Volume 2 and Whilce Portacio working on Uncanny X-Men, it was a whole different beast. It was a whole different world, and I miss it. But with that being said, we're going to bring this to an end. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.